Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. To my right is WPRI.com reporter Ted Nisi, and joining us for the second half is John Flaherty from GrowSmart, Rhode Island. I believe your title is Director of Research and Communications?
Correct.
All right, nailed it. Let's talk about tolls. There was a public outcry when we broke the story that the state wanted to put the toll booth in Hopkinton on Route 95. But your take is, hang on a second, let's give it some serious thought. Why is that?
Well, whether tolls eventually get built on Route 95 or not, we've got to have this discussion. Because what we do know is that our infrastructure has been declining for years. We also know that the funding system that we have in this state, and also the funding system we have nationally, is broken. And so we do have to look at additional revenue sources. This was one of the sources that was looked at when Governor Carcieri assembled the Blue Ribbon Panel back in 2008. So we have to have that discussion.
What do you think of this specific proposal? I realize it's early. We only know the bare outlines of how it would work, but they're talking about between exits 1 and 2 in Hopkinton. What do you think of that spot? Does this sound like something that could work?
Well, I know that the DOT did look at a number of different alternatives, particularly during that period in 2008 when the governor had the Blue Ribbon Panel formed, and it was determined that that was the preferred location for a number of reasons. I think one of them is toll avoidance, to limit toll avoidance where people get off and get back on someplace else.
Yeah, but the real reason is you're going to tick off less people by putting it down there.
Well,
Isn't that the case?
Frankly, that is, sure.
So what do you say to the Steve Hartfords, the people in Westerly that really might have a problem with it?
Well, if tolling is an option, it's got to go someplace. And I think that it's not clear yet whether we have the option of offering an advantage to Rhode Islanders, similar to the advantage that Rhode Islanders have for going over the Newport Bridge. If you have if you purchase your transponder in Rhode Island, you're paying 83 cents to go over the Newport Bridge instead of $4. It's not clear yet whether that same type of benefit can be afforded to Rhode Islanders, but it's certainly something to look at.
Mm-hmm. Your group is saying that you'd like to see some of that money used for public transit. You're a big proponent of public transit, but isn't that really wishful thinking? I think the federal government has made it perfectly clear they want to see added capacity and have the money used for infrastructure.
That's right.
So why even back it if you don't see the money going to public transit?
Well, we recognize that we look at transportation as a whole. We look at roads and bridges, we look at the transit system, and we need to sustain both of them. I mean, this is a competitiveness issue for Rhode Island. If we can't maintain a decent infrastructure, we can't support a thriving economy. It's that simple. And they're both equally important. I mean, I think many folks don't realize the role that transit plays in our state's economy. But when you look at the ridership of RIPTA, for example, we know that more than 60% are using it to get to work or school. Transit also relies on having good infrastructure. We've seen what happened when some bridges were posted where RIPTA couldn't go over the bridge, and they had to circumvent and go several miles out of the way, and that ended up costing the transit agency several $100,000 in additional fuel.
Rhode Islanders a lot of people I've talked to since we broke the story are just skeptical about the idea of putting more money into this because they feel like they've been told over and over our bridges and roads are in terrible shape, we're going to do this, we're going to raise the gas tax, we're going to put out a big bond like for the I-Way project or something like that, and this will get us where we're going, and then they're always being told, oh, it's still a crisis. Is this something that could be sustainable and people would see that the things are getting fixed and they're not going to be it's not going to come to them anymore?
Well, that's the idea, is to get to a point where it is sustainable. Right now, it's not sustainable. What we do every 2 years in this state is we put $80 million every 2 years on the credit card in order to get the federal investment in the state, and that's being paid back through gas tax receipts. And what we do know is the gas tax receipts, not only in Rhode Island but nationally, are going down. And so it's leaving less and less money available for just routine maintenance. And so there's a lot of deferred maintenance.
You happen to bring a handy dandy graph here, camera 2. You don't have to get in tight, but you can see that is the graph you supplied of gas tax proposals going down throughout the years, and I think that is up through, what do you have, 2015 here, if I can read through the paper?
It's 2015.
I mean, so let's talk about if the tolls don't happen, and this chart is a trend, what then?
Well, and that's why we're having this conversation, because there's only so many opportunities to raise revenue to support the transportation system. And the governor's Blue Ribbon Panel laid out as many as 8 options. Tolling was one of them. There were others that were looked at that frankly aren't very popular either. When you look at the gas tax, for example, we have to be mindful that we've got to remain competitive as a state. So we can't be raising our gas tax so that it's significantly higher than Massachusetts. It already is higher than Massachusetts. We're lower than Connecticut. So we need to be mindful of being competitive. And then there's been other ideas that have surfaced.
Well, let's talk about one of those ideas. I'm curious for your take on it. There's one proposal out there that the government would track how many miles you drive.
Right.
And a lot of this is in response to the more fuel-efficient cars that are out there. So there's less revenue in gas tax, right? So they would, if you go from point A to point B, that's 100 miles, they would charge you whatever per mile that is. Where do you stand on that?
You know, the VMT is a very controversial proposal. It's been tested in a couple of states.
It's
VMT, which is, I'm sorry, Vehicle Miles Traveled Tax. It's been tested in a couple of states. Frankly, I don't think that they chose a very good method for testing it. They used the GPS device, which raises all the concerns about Big Brother.
Yeah.
I think that there are other ways to pursue that. I think what's going to end up happening is that will be something that will be pursued at the federal level. Because again, it raises issues in terms of if you were to implement something like that in Rhode Island, but you've got folks who live in Rhode Island who are commuting into jobs in Boston, and they're driving their miles in Massachusetts, and they don't have that. It raises all sorts of fairness issues.
You mentioned before we borrow money in Rhode Island to get our federal match for highway funding. There's a lot of concern now that Congress might not renew the gas tax next month in September, another showdown in Washington coming up. What impact would that have on Rhode Island if the gas tax receipts plummeted all of a sudden federally?
It would stop everything. I mean, you would, if that were to happen, they wouldn't be able to collect the 18.4 cent per gallon federal gas tax. It would stop everything in its tracks. When you look at the federal, that was the chart that I showed you was the federal gas tax. That hasn't been increased since 1993, and that's why the purchasing power has gone down, and it's been compounded by the fact that you just mentioned a moment ago, which is that we have more fuel-efficient cars. We have a national energy policy which is in direct conflict with our transportation policy. Because as we do the right things and we have folks driving less and driving more fuel-efficient cars, we're collecting less revenue to support the transportation infrastructure.
So you are a proponent of gas guzzlers, I assume.
All Hummers.
John, RIPTA, bleeding money. You're, as I pointed out, a big proponent of public transportation. You know, I'm wondering what has to happen beside demanding more money from taxpayers to make RIPTA part of the Rhode Island fabric.
You know, I think it's becoming more part of the Rhode Island fabric. If you look at RIPTA...
Is ridership up?
Ridership is up. Ridership has continued to increase despite the fare increase that took effect 2 years ago.
So why are we seeing deficits? If ridership is up, you know, you would think they're getting more money in, so where's the deficit?
Well, because the cost of providing the service, the costs associated with that continue to go up. Fuel has gone up, and the actual fare box revenue, we get actually, when you look at across the nation, RIPTA's fare box revenue is actually higher percentage-wise than most other agencies, but it still doesn't cover the cost, just like we don't cover the cost of road maintenance and road repair through user fees, which I'll call the gas tax. We're not doing that on the transit side either. And so we have to, get away from this issue of coming back year after year, dealing with either higher fares or service cuts, and once and for all, fix the funding problem and make one that's more sustainable.
One other public transit thing that's now on the table is trolleys in Providence. There's a lot of people wondering what's going on.
Streetcar?
Streetcars, yeah. Streetcars. Where does that stand right now? Do you see that? Do you think that's going to happen?
I think it will happen eventually. I don't know how quickly it'll happen. When you look at the introduction of streetcars across the country, and there's many cities that are doing it, it's really an economic development issue, almost more so than a transit issue. Because when you make that investment in the fixed rails, it sends the message to the real estate market, and folks respond to that. And when you look at the level of investment that has occurred in other cities, real estate investment around streetcar routes, it's pretty significant.
Steve, less than 30 seconds here. Did you lobby with the leadership of the General Assembly in support of the toll booth?
We did not.
Did you know it was coming?
Yeah, because this is something that's been discussed since 2008 when the Blue Ribbon Panel was formed, and there's been a lot of discussion about it since then.
And sorry, I think I called you Steve.
That's
John, John Flaherty from Grossmont, Rhode Island, was our guest on the second half of Newsmakers. Steve Hartford was our guest on the first half, Westerly Town Manager. If you missed any of it, you can catch it on our website, WPRI.com. For Ted Nisi, I'm Tim White. We will see you next week right here on Newsmakers.